August 8, 1588. Near the small port town of Gravelines, which was then part of the Spanish Netherlands, located roughly in today's territory of Belgium and Luxembourg, one of the most significant naval battles of the 16th century and indeed of the early modern age takes place. On one side, the Spanish war fleet known as the Armada, led by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, and on the other side the English Navy, commanded by Admiral John Howard and Vice Admiral Francis Drake. Nothing less than the very existence of Protestant England is at stake. Spanish plan looks like this: to join forces with the army of the Spanish governor in the Netherlands, the Duke of Parma, to invade the British Isles, to reach London and there to overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. Since leaving their port, the Spaniards have faced one disaster after another, and now the English will complete the destruction. They are equipped with more maneuverable ships and cannons with greater range, completely destroying the Spanish fleet. It's all over after 8 hours when they run out of ammunition. They then sail back to their shores, leaving the scattered and damaged Spanish ships to their fate. This ends bitterly during the attempt to return to Spain around the Scottish and Irish coasts, where severe storms wreck many ships on the dangerous cliffs, and a large portion of the surviving sailors and soldiers are then captured by local coastal forces. The army that called itself fortunate and invincible ultimately returns to Spanish ports with fewer than 10,000 surviving men from the original 25,000 and only half of the 130 ships. All of them will need massive repairs. For Spanish King Philip II, it's a disaster. For the English, on the other hand, one of the most glorious victories in their history. And Francis Drake, originally a slave trader and pirate, later a favorite of the Queen, a nobleman and a member of Parliament, will be even more of a national hero. Drake came into the world around 1540. He came of age sometime in the late 1950s or early 1960s, and for the sake of understanding, we need to say at the outset what it was like in Europe at that time. The 30 Years' War between Catholics and Protestants was still nearly 60 years away, but Europe was already being convulsed by the Reformation and the continent was beginning to be divided into Catholic and Protestant parts. On the Catholic part was led by Spain, a country that had been a maritime power and, after Columbus' discovery of America, the greatest colonial power, was already reaping fabulous profits from overseas. The Spanish kings of that time ruled an empire that stretched around the globe and was the first empire in history over which, literally, the sun never set. And England? At that time, there was no great power. The unpredictable King Henry VIII had led England out of the Catholic world 20 years earlier, following a conflict with the Pope over his first divorce, and established the Anglican Church, of which he was the head. When his daughter from his first marriage, Mary, then came to the throne, she began to push hard for a return to Catholicism, which incidentally earned her the nickname of Bloody Mary. But far more importantly for us, she married Philip II, who was crowned King of Spain shortly afterwards. England and Spain thus became the closest of allies. But in 1558, Mary dies and Elizabeth ascends the throne, also the daughter of Henry VIII, but by a subsequent marriage to Anne of Boleyn. She turns the wheel the other way round. She returns everything in the order her father established. The Catholics are once again, and as it turns out, forever out of luck. Philip II, however, needs England because of its strategic position opposite the Spanish Netherlands, and thus he attempts to persuade Elizabeth to marry him as well. She refuses, and relations between the two countries understandably cools down, gradually reaching a freezing point. And here comes right moment to return to the story of Francis Drake. Drake was born in the south of England, just close to the important port of Plymouth. His father was a farmer. He was the eldest of 12 children. He began his career at sea as a merchant's assistant carrying goods to France, then went to work for John Hawkins, who in the 60s traded in linen and other goods, but soon came to a more lucrative commodity: black slaves. Portugal had a monopoly on the importation of slaves from Africa to the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and on the American mainland, but Hawkins successfully broke it. At the same time, he had Queen Elizabeth's crown jewel, which allowed some privateer owners to raid enemy vessels and settlements and extract booty from them. This was known as privateering and was practiced by England, especially against the Spanish, even when war was not declared between the two countries. The English crown thus compensated for the weakness of its fleet compared to the Spanish, and at the same time secured its share of the profits from this plunder and pillage. And so, during the 1660s and 1670s, Hawkins and later Drake, now as captain of his own ship, plundered Spanish ports on the American side of the Atlantic, raiding ships carrying treasure that the Spanish had acquired in their conquest of the Native American empires. Drake achieves an exceptional success in Panama, where he stole 20 tons of gold and silver from the Spanish. On another occasion, Drake and Hawkins narrowly escaped a Spanish ambush. In what is now Veracruz, Mexico, Drake even had to flee, leaving Hawkins on his ship to his fate. In England, he was then held responsible for treason and attempted embezzlement. From then on, historians say he hated the Spanish with a passion. Drake was anything but a lamb. He was very harsh with both his enemies and his crew, punishing the slightest hint of disobedience or even rebellion. He is documented, among other things, to have been involved in the massacre of 600 inhabitants of a castle on Rathlin Island off the Irish coast, where the rebellious MacDonald clan was based. Although they surrendered, they were all slaughtered. Castle defenders, women, children, and old men. On the other hand, it was common for Drake to let the crews of overpowered ships survive and sail away with deliberately damaged ships during his actions in the Caribbean and off the coast of America. This served a dual purpose. Firstly, the enemy ships were more willing to surrender to him, and in addition, the Spanish could continue to spread the legend of the invincible corsair. They called him El Drake, the dragon, and the name alone was terrifying. This was the reason why Queen Elizabeth entrusted him with a secret mission in 1577. He was supposed to sail through the so-called Magellan Strait to the west coast of America, navigate along it as far north as the territory no longer claimed by the Spanish crown, and acquire these new lands and their natural wealth for England. It was a groundbreaking journey. It lasted 3 years, and during it, Drake was the first to discover that South America could be circumnavigated around Cape Horn, and there was no need to navigate the treacherous Magellan Strait among the fjords and islands of Tierra del Fuego. In present-day Chile and Peru, he rampaged through Spanish settlements, raiding Spanish merchant ships. He went as far north along the coast as anyone before him, anchored off San Francisco, and acquired for the English crown the territory of what is now California, which he named New Albion. He even sought a so-called northern passage back to the Atlantic around present-day Canada that would have provided a safer return than the Spanish and Portuguese-controlled Pacific, but he had to turn back. He was driven away by the bitter cold. Eventually, he sailed back to England via the Moluccas, where he received a cargo of valuable spices around Africa. He was the second man in history to complete a circumnavigation of the world. Of the 5 ships, he got only one back home, the Golden Hind. Even though he had to sacrifice a large part of the cargo to the sea during a storm to get the boat of the reefs, he still was left with enough for a fairy tale wealth for both him and the Queen, as well as a noble title given to him in 1581 by the Queen. In 1585, the Spanish-English War, which had been fought only covertly until then, finally broke out in earnest. In it, Drake again made raids on Spanish cities in the Caribbean. Among other things, he plundered Santo Domingo in what is now the Dominican Republic, which was the Spanish pride of the entire region, and returned home a national hero. No wonder Queen Elizabeth gave him a prominent role in the planned Spanish invasion. He was to lead the country's naval defense from the position of Vice Admiral. His preemptive strike on the Spanish port of Cadiz and the way he, along with Admiral Charles Howard and his old acquaintance, the corsair John Hawkins, conducted defensive tactics were outstanding. They were also fortunate. The Spaniards faced the worst possible weather from the start. but the final outcome was a triumph. It was here that the English fleet began to transform into a dominant naval force, and the foundations were laid for Britain's future position as the greatest colonial power. However, it was as if Drake's lucky star left him at that moment. A year later, he suffered a series of crushing defeats when he sought to ride the wave of his previous victories by attacking Spanish ports and later attacked Lisbon to incite a revolt against Philip II, who was also ruling Portugal at the time. The failure was so great that he was removed from high command, and for the next 6 years he led no naval expedition. Only then did he set out again with John Hawkins and a fleet of 27 ships for the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean Sea. They decided to attack the city of San Juan in Puerto Rico, but without success. The expedition was plagued by disease, and Hawkins died at sea shortly after the defeat at San Juan. Finally, in January 1596, Drake attempted to launch an overland attack on the city of Panama, where Spanish treasures were amassed before their journey to Europe. However, the weakened English forces were repelled once again, and a week later, near Portobello on the Caribbean coast of Panama, approximately 55-year-old Francis Drake died of dysentery. Thus, symbolically and in the place where he was most famous, ends the life of one of the greatest navigators and naval strategists of all time, whom most people in England still consider a hero, while in Spain he is seen as a simple common pirate.